Thank you so much to everyone for your presentations. They've been fantastic. It's really nice to have that reminder, really think in detail about some of those thorny issues, and then they're really brought alive by those case studies. So thank you to Jill for that. I'll be totally honest with you, there's been so many fantastic questions. I haven't been able to keep up with all of them. I did start writing them down and making some themes at the start. And I think I'm going to focus on those that maybe weren't so directly tackled within the slides. And then we can look over all of the questions afterwards. And if there's any that we feel that weren't tackled in the slides and haven't been tackled in what Susan's already put together, which is her responses to some of the pre-webinar questions, then we'll tackle those there. I'm going to come to Susan for quite a lot of them, I'm afraid, Susan. There's been a few questions. I'm going to just go back to the start, which I think are quite topical. So right at the start, somebody asked about remote assessment. So is it acceptable and valid to use results from remote assessment to make a DLD diagnosis? There's the person asking the question said they felt there's some evidence to support remote assessment, but there are complications as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Susan.
I suppose one thing is that publishers of the tests are putting on their websites whether or not you can use their assessments for remote teletherapy assessment. So you need to look at the individual tests. Of course, the main thing that you can't do remotely is assess the child's functioning in school, and actually the more functional side of the assessments. So I think if I could only do remote assessment and I was pretty sure it was DLD, I might be saying, I think this might be DLD, but I really need to see the child in different circumstances and do some other tests face to face. So I would probably be giving a hint that I think this may be DLD, but I can't confirm it at the moment because of the situation we're in, and I really need to see how the child is functioning in different situations, and you can't just do that remotely. And hopefully there will be opportunities to see the children in other circumstances later, but I don't think I would want to be not mentioning the diagnosis at all if I think it's quite likely, because it means that the parents can start looking at relevant information and actually thinking for themselves, actually, yes, looking at their adult website and thinking, yes, actually, my child is actually very similar to these children, and I think it could be this, or actually, no, this is nothing like my child at all, and that could be part of the discussion. So I think I wouldn't want to give any firm diagnoses just from teletherapy assessments. I think you probably can get useful information. You could at least say, this is what I'm thinking it might be.
Yeah. And I guess does that sort of align a little bit with recommendations around potentially particularly where there's a bit of uncertainty, doing repeat assessments. So kind of assessments at 2 different points in time. And who knows when this COVID period will finish, but I guess it's similar to that.
I mean, there were some questions that came in before the webinar, and also a few I've noticed here saying about, can I make a diagnosis on one assessment? I don't think one assessment is always the same thing, though. One assessment might be 15 minutes with the child, or one assessment might be 3 days with the child, watching them in different situations. So I don't think you can just say a single assessment. It depends how thorough that assessment is and how many different situations you've seen the child in, how many areas of language you've assessed. So I don't think we can say you can't do it just on one point in time. If you've got a child with very severe needs, say you've got a 5-year-old who is only using single words, I mean, that's pretty unlikely that that's going to resolve spontaneously. I think you could be more confident in starting to talk about the diagnosis more quickly in that circumstance. Whereas if you've got a child with milder difficulties, maybe who hasn't been in school, who's been mainly speaking another language, then you want to wait and see actually what happens with time. You've got a younger child where things are going to change a lot. So I think it depends on the situation as to whether you need, how long the process needs to take, and how detailed your assessment and wide-ranging your assessment is.
Fantastic, thank you. There's just a couple of points of clarification, actually. So I think during the slides, people have been asking, just to clarify, where there are more structural language issues present, that points more towards the DLD side, whereas if there are more kind of social and pragmatic issues present, that points more towards the autism side. Is that correct, Susan?
Yeah, I think I've confused people slightly by showing the ones with the ASD and DLD, saying some children with ASD may also have structural problems like children with DLD, and that needs to be noted. And some children with DLD may have pragmatic problems. The primary ASD, the primary need is social pragmatic, and DLD, it is mainly structural, but that doesn't mean that the other group can't also have those difficulties. That's what I meant. So I think I may have confused people there.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Jill Earle, I'm just going to come to you quickly. I think there was a question around whether R, in your case, had a cognitive or a psychological assessment.
No, he hadn't. And actually, where we work, it would be very unusual for a child to have a cognitive assessment that provided an IQ score. But I think, bearing in mind that he's hypothetical, I think in his case, his insight into his own difficulties, the fact that he was able to manage sort of independence of personal living at an appropriate level for his age, and also I think the fact that he was able to respond to a kind of phonological approach to his speech sound difficulties would probably also suggest that he wasn't presenting with an intellectual impairment. So that wasn't really, I don't think that was so difficult a decision in his case. I'm sorry if I didn't make that tremendously clear within the case study.
No, not at all. And I think that really aligns with Susan, what you were saying about the slight shift in perception amongst DSM around cognitive assessment, I guess. And if I understood you correctly, your suggestion was actually it is possible to make these diagnoses without a formal EP or pediatrician's assessment if it is abundantly clear that there are no sort of difficulties with general functioning and it's obvious that learning is going well. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the problem is if you've got DLD, that's going to affect your learning. So it is really tricky when you're looking at academic functioning because you're going to expect that to be affected. So I think maybe we need to place a bit more weight on looking at their functioning in other ways, like their personal independence and how they manage problem solving in other ways. So we can't just rely on academic because that's going to be affected by the language.
Yeah.
Actually, there's another point I wanted to make on that. So several of the questions were asking about learning disabilities versus intellectual disability. I think we tend to use learning disability more in the UK and intellectual disability more in the States, and global developmental delay as well. So I think there's various terms for roughly the same kind of thing, but it's more of a geographical distinction, because in the States, learning disabilities means reading and maths, more like dyslexia and dyscalculia. So that's partly why that's been avoided in the catalyzed papers, because learning disability means something completely different in the States. Whereas here it is more general.
Okay. I had so many questions lined up to ask, but we are rapidly running out of time. I'm just going to go for one more. And sorry, Susan, I'm going to come to you again. There's a question about indicators. And the suggestion is, I mean, I guess it would be maybe worthwhile talking about, particularly for for all age ranges, sorry. There is a suggestion that if there are indicators of poor prognosis, then it makes it more likely that a diagnosis should be given. Could you just tell us about those indicators and whether they are non-linguistic or linguistic or a bit of both?
Okay, I think we're talking about two different things. So when I was talking about indicators of poor prognosis, that's for under fives, because just by being 5, that's already an indicator of a poor prognosis. So in older children, you sort of don't need those. If they've got language difficulties and they've been learning that language and they've been in school and they still haven't got it and they've had good support in school, then it's probably a language disorder. So when I was talking about poor prognosis, that was more in those under 5s, where you're trying to predict which children are going to continue having problems into school age as opposed to those who are going to resolve, which is very difficult to do on an individual basis. But the general indicators do seem to be around severity of that language disorder and how many areas of language are affected, and the family history, poor gesture and things like that. The linguistic indicators are more a quick way of potentially identifying the language disorder. So things like recalling sentences and past tenses are really quite strong indicators. Children who have difficulties with those, well, children who have DLD usually have difficulties with recalling sentences and past tenses. So if you want a quick indicator as to, do I think this child may or may not have it? If they're actually fine at recalling sentences, they probably don't have DLD. So that's more a how quickly to get it, do they have a language problem? The other indicators are more, I already know they've got difficulties with language, is it likely to persist? So it's two different things, I think.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, very much so. I think definitely it was worth focusing on those poor prognosis indicators from the fives. And I think as well, you tackled the question about sort of linguistic markers in over fives as well. I am going to have to, unfortunately, there's so many more questions. I'm so sorry we can't tackle all of them, but as I say, we will look over both the questions in the chat function and the questions in the Q&A after the event and pick out key themes and endeavour to answer those in a written document. Obviously, the catalysed papers themselves as the original source, the briefing paper from the RCSLT, this or the previous webinar, the training slides and the various other fantastic international resources that exist. We hope that that supports you with your understanding and confidence in this area. If there are further resources you feel as though RCSLT, RADLD and NAPLIC can develop that would support you, then please do use the survey to let us know about this. Just to thank everyone for presenting today. I thought they were really fantastic, clear presentations, which have hopefully taken our understanding in this area a little bit further. And thank you as well to those who've joined and have asked questions. Hopefully we've addressed some of the key questions that you have. And as I say, we'll continue to address others with a written document afterwards. So thank you so much. We're just about finished on time. I look forward to next steps in this area.